Let's go out to the hotline right now and welcome in the director of the Senior Bowl and also spent many years in the NFL. And that, of course, is Phil Savage, who joins us right now. Phil, Zach, and Mike here on Temple's campus in Philadelphia. Thanks for a few minutes, and how are you?
Well, good morning, guys. Hope both of you are doing well.
Well, we're doing great, and we appreciate you giving us a few minutes today. So Matt Rule was talking about the Senior Bowl yesterday at his press conference that is weekly on Tuesdays, and he said Tavon Young, Matt Ioannidis, and Tyler Medikevich are going to the Senior Bowl this year. What did you see out of those three guys to give them the invitations?
Well, I think when you look at the progress that Temple has made as a football program, you look to their senior class, and these are three players that at every level of the defense, the defensive line, the linebacker level, and then the defensive secondary, all three of these young guys, they played exceptionally well. I think Matt Ioannidis is interesting to the NFL people because of his height, his size, the fact that he can probably fit into a 3-4 front. Tyler Medikevich has been so productive all year. Every time he flipped on television, he seemed to be making a play when Temple was on the screen. And then Tavon Young is extremely competitive. He's got some cover ability. There's just not enough corners to cover 32 teams in the NFL. We think he's got a great chance to really showcase what he can do here.
You guys do a really good job in finding players from a lot of different schools, not necessarily always the Power 5 schools. Like, for example, Medikevich this year, he's been up for a bunch of awards, and he got nominated as semifinalist for the Bednarik Award, but then didn't even get a finalist or a semifinalist from the Buckus Award. How do you go about selecting these players? Because you guys do a good job at getting well-rounded players and players that aren't just from the major schools.
Well, we try to cast a wide net. When I got the job here in the spring of 2012 after that draft, I just felt like that we could run the Reese's Senior Bowl like it was a 33rd NFL team. You know, let's build out a watch list. Let's make it public in August. And then let's go try to see as many of these players as we can in person. I think I got to 37 teams this fall. A wide variety from, Alabama, which I do the color every Saturday for the Tide, and their opponents all the way to, Harvard, and it seems like every level of football in between. And we have several staff members here that go to games on a weekend basis. And then I rely on a lot of my NFL friends from being in that league for 20 years. We vet every player that's invited in terms of what their strengths and weaknesses are and what their draft value might really be. I think the hardest part for us is the fact that it is an all-star game, but it's also a pre-draft event, and sometimes those things don't necessarily mesh because there are certain kids that project extremely well in the NFL that don't have great production in college, and there's other players that have tremendous production in college that may not translate to the NFL level, and that's probably the hardest decisions for us.
One senior that, if he gets the invite to the Combine, I think is going to blow people away is Kyle Friend, an offensive lineman who's been battling some injuries but was cleared back yesterday to play, and he bench pressed 225 pounds 43 times. Did you all consider Kyle Friend for the Senior Bowl?
I'm looking at Kyle Friend's name on my up-to-date depth chart right now, and, he stands as an alternate for us. This is actually a fairly strong center class this year, particularly with the seniors that are coming out in 2016. So he's a player we're well aware of, and we'll monitor and see how it all develops here over the next month, over the bowl season in terms of injuries and players that may ultimately decide to back out of our game.
We're talking to the executive director of the Senior Bowl and former NFL GM, and that's Phil Savage. And Phil, in that former GM position that you had, when you went to the draft and you were selecting players, how did you distinguish between a guy's work of art or his body of work, I should say, when he's in a Power 5 conference versus when he's in just a Group of 5 school?
Well, I think it goes certainly beyond just, the big schools. I think you have to consider the FCS level, Division II. And, last year we had a player here named Ali Marpet from Hobart College. He was actually a Division III player, and he started for most of the year in Tampa. Now he's had an injury here of late. But I think when the NFL goes in and looks at players that are not playing against Ohio State or Texas A&M or whoever it might be, they really have to stand out and dominate their level of competition. I think that's the first factor, is that if you didn't know who they were or their jersey number or anything, you could just put the tape on and your eyes would gravitate toward the guy making the most plays, either on offense or defense or as a returner or what have you. And that usually is a pretty good indicator that, you know, he didn't belong at that level. He should have been playing at a better competition level than he is right now. And, you know, we usually try to have a small school player, so to speak, in every position group, and it gives them such a stage, a platform to compete here against guys that they've watched on television during their own college career.
Now, how much of the Senior Bowl is about recognition and rewarding these players for their dedication and hard work to the sport of football, throughout their time with their program, and how much of it is just showcasing their talent to the rest of the nation and now maybe future NFL execs?
I think it's a mixture of the two. In reality, obviously, we're going to have a ton of players that would qualify as an all-star. But we also have players that qualify as future NFL players. So it's definitely a mixture of the two. I think the neat thing about this is the fact that in a given practice, you can have the Harvard offensive tackle going against the Ohio State defensive end as an example. And that is such a picture for the NFL scouts in terms of being able to project a smaller school player to the next level. And then also seeing that big school player, really compete and not rest on his laurels. There's an old saying that, you not only have to shine the front of your shoes, but you also have to shine the back of your shoes. And I think the Senior Bowl is a real proving ground when it comes down to a situation like that.
Getting back to Tyler Medikevich, he's a player that's just really special, and he's produced here for all 4 years at Temple, being 1 out of 7 players in the history of the NCAA to accumulate 100 tackles in each of his 4 seasons, and he's at 473 now for his career. You've seen a lot of really outstanding college football players through the Senior Bowl and all the work that you've done for the NFL. Is there a player that you could compare Tyler to that's in the league now or that you've seen before go through this process?
I would say with Tyler, the big question for the NFL people is going to be, what are his real numbers? What are his real test numbers? How big is he? How fast is he going to run? Because the production is there. And, you guys remember Zach Thomas. He was out at Texas Tech, and people really overlooked him. He was under 6 feet. He didn't run particularly well, but he ended up having an all-pro career down with the Miami Dolphins. So that's a name that comes to mind. I wouldn't make it a direct comparison, but I do think sometimes a player can be sold short because of his height, weight, and speed, when in reality all he is a good football player.
We're spending a few minutes with Phil Savage, the director of the Senior Bowl. And, Phil, while we have you here, let's talk some Eagles. Right now, they're in the midst of a really bad losing streak, had some pathetic performances up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and then on Thanksgiving up against the Lions. A lot of blame is going towards the way of Chip Kelly because he is that head coach and GM. Where's your confidence level in Chip Kelly that he'll be able to turn this thing around?
Well, I think in all these situations, particularly in the NFL, because the season is so long, you really have to let it play itself out. And, of course, right now it's not playing out very well with this 3-game losing streak. The Eagles statistically have really struggled defensively. You can see it with your own eyes in terms of what's happened the last couple games. But I think this is going to be a real test for Chip Kelly and his staff to keep everything tight-knit, close together. They've got to close ranks here because when these other organizations and other teams see weakness, they'll look at it and say, hey, we can beat the Eagles. And so they've got to keep their confidence level up internally because there's going to be a lot of outside noise. This is a real test for any NFL head coach. You're always going to have ups and downs. They're in a down cycle right now, and I think the real question that everybody wants to see is, can they pull themselves out of this and finish out the year in a division that is still there for the taking?
You've been on teams where there's been a GM and a head coach that have been different people. You've also seen teams like an Andy Reid, who he has both of those titles. Chip Kelly, obviously here in Philadelphia, is the head coach and the GM. He's displayed that he could win in this league as a head coach with 2 10-win seasons. However, on the GM front, he didn't draft an offensive lineman the last 2 years, and I know he's only been the GM for 1 year, and he's made a lot of questionable roster moves. Let's just say at the end of the year, this is throwing a hypothetical out there, if the Eagles owner, Jeffrey Lurie, came up to him and said, Chip, we really like you as the head coach, but not so much as the GM, and we want to bring a GM in here. Do you think that would be something that Chip would be willing to change to go back to being just the head coach, or do you think he would say, hey, Jeff, I'm going on the way out. I want to be both?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I will say this, that most of the time, if you go back through the history of the NFL, when they've hired a college coach, because the college coach sort of had a kingdom at his particular university, most of the time to attract that college coach into the league, you have to give him that kind of authority. I mean, you go back to Nick Saban at Miami, Steve Spurrier at the Redskins to a degree. There have been a number of different examples over the course of time. And I think that, running a college program and recruiting is a lot different than being the GM of an NFL team where you're scouting. I've always heard the phrase that in college it's 90% recruiting and 10% evaluations. In the pros, it's 90% evaluations and 10% recruiting, and that's a huge difference between the two levels of the sport. I think that you learn in player personnel over the course of time. You learn from your mistakes, and that's why usually you have it as two separate parts of the building. I know when I was at the Ravens and Ozzie Newsome was our GM, people don't think about this, but Ozzie's now working with his third head coach, Ted Marchibroda to Brian Billick to now John Harbaugh. And they've always been able to keep that side of the building in scouting sort of intact so that they could learn from their mistakes and it didn't just kill everybody. And so I think with that being said, at least in my estimation, I think it's always better to have a bit of a separation of power, so to speak, until it's proven otherwise. And there's exceptions. I mean, Bill Belichick has obviously done great in New England, but that's a rare circumstance, I think, when you look at the landscape of the NFL overall.
How difficult is it at the NFL level when your team isn't playing well to just reel back and say, you know what, guys, we need to rebuild through the draft and just recognize that, you know what, maybe this plan isn't working? Because whenever a team is losing, everyone loves to point fingers and then they think catastrophic things need to happen. How hard is it to take that step back and say this might be a 3-4 year process that we need to build through the draft?
Well, it's such an emotional sport, and I think when you're connected to the team and the players as a coach, whether it's an assistant coach or the head coach, I think it's very hard to take that step back and be able to see the forest for the trees because you're so close to the situation. You live and die with the wins and losses over the course of a year, and you're not able to really have the perspective of, you know what, we're not very good at this position, or so-and-so didn't really play very well. We need to find somebody better. And I think that you have to be real honest with yourself at the end of the season. I know in my time at the Ravens and then again at the Browns when I was the GM, we would let cooler heads sit for a couple weeks, and then we would have our end-of-year review so that we could analyze every player from A to Z, on the field, off the field, his actions in the community, how he actually played at the beginning of the year versus at the end of the season, when times were up, when times are down, what's his health look like now and in the future. I mean, we just did a full autopsy on our roster with every given player, and I think it's hard to do that when you're this close to it as the coach. Again, that separation of authority sometimes can give you a little better perspective on what you really have.
You know, we're sitting here and we're talking about evaluating players, and Bill Belichick, who the Eagles play this week, always finds a way to get that undrafted free agent, whether it's a Malcolm Butler or a late-round draft pick like a Tom Brady in the 6th round or Julian Edelman in the 7th round, and just find a way to make them be great and have these outstanding Hall of Fame type of careers and win multiple Super Bowls. And he hasn't had to worry about losing for the last 15 years. But you were able to spend time with Bill in Cleveland. Can you just take us behind the scenes of what it's like to work with Bill Belichick? Because it just seems like every year, no matter what adversity they face, he always finds a way to prevail.
Yeah, I was with Bill Belichick and Nick Saban, that whole group of people in the early 90s, and that was almost a proverbial football think tank. And we made a lot of mistakes from 1991 to 1995, in truth. And I think that, again, the trial and error aspect of being a head coach and then also pulling the strings as a personnel man. Bill told me one time, he said, look, it's the one part of my resume that wasn't particularly strong when I got the head coaching job in Cleveland. So I think it's been a work in progress for him over the years. I think the thing that he's mastered over the course of time has been identifying what a player can do and trying to emphasize that and keeping that player out of harm's way when it came to something that he's not particularly strong at. So with that being said, they can take 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th rounders and seem to make something out of those players when maybe other people haven't been able to do that. But their development of prospects behind the scenes obviously is second to none when you factor in all the injuries that they've had through the years. And, of course, all of it helps, too, that you have a Hall of Fame quarterback that's your hardest worker on the team in Tom Brady. But even despite that, they've gotten production from people that a lot of other teams said, they're not good enough to play for us.
Well, Phil, we appreciate a few minutes today. Thanks so much. Excellent stuff. And, of course, best of luck with the Senior Bowl. And I also have to say, I hope your daughter has a fantastic gymnastics career, Phil.
All right, guys. I really appreciate it. The next stop, Olympics, right?
That's right. All right.
The 4-year-old Olympic game.
All right, Phil. Thanks so much. There's Phil Savage, just joking around with him a little bit at the end. He was going to come on with us last week, but his daughter was in a gymnastics meet. And it's funny because when I interviewed Phil 2 times, 2 years ago, I want to say, his daughter was actually crying in the back seat as he was on the phone with us. So we always had to track the career of Phil Savage's daughter, who's a fine gymnast now.
Well, hopefully Olympics is on her way.